Hi, everybody. This is Gruenke, founder of the Balanced Runner System. I've been helping runners from beginner to Olympian improve their form and performance since 2003. And I'm here today with another stuck-at-home running form tip from my living room to yours, helping you use this time as an opportunity to become a better runner. So I've been talking in the last few videos about your core and what should not and what should be going on with your core and how to warm it up properly. So if you missed any of those videos, especially the second one on what your core should be doing, it would be a good idea to watch that along with this video, because this will make a lot more sense. But there was one more thing. I thought I was done yesterday with the core series, though we're going to be touching on it as we look at other elements of form in upcoming videos. But I realized this morning that I really wasn't. Because there's a whole aspect of your form that has a really strong impact on your ability to use your core, a reciprocal relationship. So it makes good core movement possible and at the same time benefits from good core movement, and that's your legs. And so I want to show you now what the relationship between your legs and your core action is, and how actually what you're doing in your hip joints might be preventing your core from working properly when you run. And then I'll give you a resource to help you address that and make a big improvement between now and the very next time you go for a run. So I'm wearing stripes again today, like yesterday, so that you can see what my core is doing. And I may have to fiddle. And Leroy's in the house, in case you're looking for her. I know Leroy is developing quite a fan base here on YouTube. All right. So your pelvis movement, obviously, I put dots, which I hope you can see, blue dots on roughly where my hip joints are and on my kneecaps. And I have spare blue dots in case these ones fall off. So your core action is the counter rotation of your pelvis. It's the spiraling action of your torso, which means that your pelvis and your upper body are counter rotating. Note the movement of the stripes, which is a twist here. There's no core action without your pelvis moving. And it makes a movement. It makes a movement in what we call the transverse plane, meaning it rotates. I'm standing up, so that rotation is parallel to the ground, but if I were leaning forward, that rotation would be parallel to the line of my spine, right? So you'd be on a forward angle, right? And then because I'm not on 2 feet when I run, but I alternate feet, there's also a movement in what we call the frontal or coronal plane, this one. Every time I move my hand, she meows. Which means your pelvis tilts this way. And if you can see, well, you can certainly see the line here, but it's actually easier to see pelvis movement a little lower down, because the closer you get to here, the less movement there is. So the waistband isn't always a clear sign. For me at the moment with this size movement, it is. But when you're looking at runners, this is actually something that's easier to see on women than on men, because women might be wearing like a brief that sits across the front of the hip, the anterior superior iliac crest, the hip bones here that you can feel, whereas a man's shorts, or anybody wearing shorts, is more likely to come up to the waist a bit higher, and so you won't see as much movement there. So when you're looking to evaluate this in runners, bear that in mind, that you want to be looking a bit lower than the waist to really see what the pelvis is doing. Anyway, so the pelvis is doing this, and the pelvis is doing this, and it's doing them at the same time. So what that means is that the hip is coming up and moving forward, which pushes the other one down and back, and then it reverses. And that can end up having kind of a figure 8 kind of quality. And again, this is a bigger movement than you're going to see most of the time in running, though it varies, as I've said. So what limits your ability for your pelvis to do this movement? Well, what you're doing with your abdominal muscle and back muscles, very strongly so. So if I hollow, or if I try and pull back, or if I brace my abdomen, then that really restricts my ability to use my obliques, particularly, to create this movement and to control this movement. And so it's important not to do the wrong thing with your abdominal muscles and to allow them to do the right thing, which is to facilitate this movement. Okay, but your pelvis doesn't just have a top; it also has a bottom, and the bottom of your pelvis is your hip joints, your legs, and here also tension in the muscles that act on your hip joints. So that would be your hip flexors, your adductors that pull the leg in, that's your inner thigh muscles, your abductors, your outer hip muscles that pull the leg out, and then your glutes and hamstrings, your hip joint hyperextenders, the ones that create hip joint extension. Not thinking for a moment, we're just thinking about the action here. Many of the muscles also have actions at the knees, and we're just going to set that aside for the purposes of this video. If those or any of them are chronically contracted and don't allow movement in a range of motion, your leg is going to be kind of glued to your pelvis, and rather than fling it around like this when you run, you're going to restrict the movement of your pelvis. And you're probably going to do it asymmetrically, and that's probably going to be closely associated with any kind of injury that you get. So let's look at what the hip joints need to be doing in order to allow for a good and a symmetrical core action. So hopefully you can see my blue dots. Hip joints, kneecaps. As I stand here, more or less in line. So if I do this pelvis movement, and I'm going to just walk forward with this pelvis movement, sorry, just considering the camera, with the muscles around my hip joints kind of holding my legs, my thighs into my hip joints. Right? You get the knees turn in and they go out, and the legs are rotating when the pelvis rotates. It's not, you don't want to be running like that. And why do you not want to be running like that? Because you can't apply force to the ground. The force is all dissipated this way and this way, right? But I didn't have to tell you that. You can just look at it and see that's just not going to work. And you can probably look at it and think of people you've seen running almost like that, or with one leg almost like that, and it doesn't work well. And unfortunately, the first thing that a runner who's doing something like that is probably going to get is stability issues and maybe orthotics to keep their arches from collapsing, with the idea that this is going to make the leg work better. But what was happening, the foot was just an effect of the fact that you don't know how to use your legs separately from your pelvis and work with the muscles so that the pelvis movement ends up creating more force into the ground. So again, you have a good core action, and I'm going to repeat my slow motion running demo from 2 videos ago. So you get the pelvis makes its movement, this hip coming up and forward, this hip then getting pushed down and back basically, and the leg did not rotate. The kneecap is still pointed forward, right? And then again here the pelvis is making its movement, but the leg is coming apparently straight through. It is coming straight through. And you see the blue dot on my knee is still pointing forward, right? And again, one more time, like this, right? So the pelvis is making this movement. I'm going to lose that dot. Fresh dot, more sticky. Unfortunately, when I sat down to type in the title of this video beforehand, it bent my dots. So the pelvis is making this movement, but the legs are still working straight forward. So how does that happen? That's movement in the hip joint. And it's so when my right side of my pelvis goes up and forward. Wait, no, I'm going to break this down into planes of movement. So when one side of the pelvis goes up and the other goes down, right? If I keep the relationship between this leg and this hip the way it is, and I put the hip back down again, it's like that. That's adduction in the hip joint. My leg, when I lift my hip but leave my leg where it is, that leg is now actually adducted, right? It's brought towards the midline. So that again, if I now lock this relationship and I let my hip go down again, the leg is actually crossed over. Same movement, what does that mean in this hip joint? So if I lock that relationship and make my pelvis level again, you see that the hip is actually abducted, abducted. It's actually taken out, right? Away from the midline. So when your pelvis makes a movement like this, that's effectively, your legs are effectively like this in your hip joints, right? If your pelvis makes a big movement. And, obviously then you need to be able to do the same on the other side. Let's see if my bookcase can handle it. So you need adduction, which is legs to the midline, and abduction, legs away from the midline, to be available for you in order to have a core action that keeps the legs functioning like this. Same thing now if we look at the transverse plane of movement, the turning plane of movement. Sorry, that's not level with the ground. This one. So if I turn my pelvis right hip forward, and like I could do that and carry my legs along with, but that's not, and that will happen when you're doing the twist, right? But that's not good. That was for you, Ingrid. But that's not going to happen, we hope, when you're running. So if we do that the way it works when you're running, standing still is actually fairly difficult. So I've kept my knees pointed straight forward, but you can see my dots move to the left because I've turned my pelvis. So again, if I lock that relationship now and I put my pelvis back, where my knee dot is, this leg is turned out. So for me to be able to do this movement of my pelvis, keep my leg pointed forward, that's effectively external rotation in my hip joint. I have to have that or my pelvis can't turn. What happens on the other side? If I turn my pelvis the same way and I don't let my leg turn, a little like patting the head and rubbing the stomach, and then I bring that pelvis back to where it came from, but I make the legs stay in relationship to it. You see the dot is to the inside. This leg is now significantly internally rotated. Oops, pelvis pointing forward. Make sure I've done that well for you, so you believe me. There. The leg is now internally rotated. Let me do that again with the camera a little lower so you can see my feet, because it may be more effective than seeing the dots. So again, actually, for my own health, I'm going to turn my pelvis the other way. So if I keep my knees pointed forward, but I turn my pelvis the way that I would in running, if I keep this relationship as it is now and put my pelvis back straight, you see this leg is pointed out. So that was what happened in that hip joint, external rotation in order to be able to turn my pelvis. If I turn my pelvis if I turn my pelvis this way without affecting my right leg, and then I lock that relationship and I put my pelvis back square, you see my right leg, oops. Yeah, no, sorry, this one is turned out. If I do that, this one is turned in. That's all right. It's that I'm turning my pelvis the wrong way. Yeah, here. This one is actually turned out. And again, if I turn to the right, I lock this relationship, I put my pelvis back, you see my right leg is actually turned in. So even though what we see when we see a runner appears to be, oops, that's too high, appears to be just flexion and extension in the hip joint, in fact, if you don't have that internal and external rotation, an add and abduction, your pelvis can't move, or it can't move enough. Or if you have a difference between one side and the other, which honestly most people do in at least one of those facets, your pelvis can't move symmetrically, and that means your weight can't move symmetrically. And then you're going to have really asymmetrical stress on your body which can turn into an injury if your stress and recovery balance gets disturbed. And that would be a whole lot. So when you have adequate internal and external rotation in your feet, see that? And when you have adequate internal or adduction and abduction, I have to do that because I can't, if I could suspend myself, I could swing my legs that way. Then you can have a pelvis that makes this good core action when you run, and legs that transmit that force into the ground. And what that means is that your torso, because of the hip moving down, pushes into the ground each time. That your torso becomes part of your spring system, as I've said before. And that force is transmitted into the ground. And ground reaction force is transmitted up into the torso through legs that are transmitting force rather than dissipating it to either side. All right? So this is why having a pelvis that moves actually makes for better force transmission through the skeleton to the ground in both directions than having a pelvis, let me see if I can do it, that stays more still. I can't even, if I really try to lock this, well, you see it doesn't lock still, but I'm restricting it. But if I let it go, I get a big step and I get a big push, and you can hear the thump of me landing. All right? So that was, there's a little more complicated detail in that than in some of the other things that we've talked about, because I'm guessing the idea is pretty new to you. But, well, I don't need to say it's important. I've just said it's important. So we've just been working on a lesson that combines these things. So all of those movements of the legs and the hip joints, and the movement of the pelvis, and how that moves the spine, the way that we looked at in yesterday's video, all the way up through into the neck, because getting the head over the standing foot is critical, for that force transmission. We've just been working on this completely awesome lesson that puts all of that together in my monthly advanced class just last Saturday. It's my favorite lesson to teach. And the reason I love it is because people get their springiness back, and they get a good lean from it, and running gets so much easier. You stop losing that feeling that you have to push hard at the ground, because the push is just happening through your structure. So you don't have to really muscle it the way that you might be used to muscling it, especially when you're trying to run fast. So I'm going to put my best free resource that I have for you, a link to that in the description below. It's a lesson called Free Your Feet. I created it actually to help people with plantar fasciitis and Achilles tendon problems. And one of the reasons that it does that is because it helps the legs and the core work together in the ways that I'm talking about. And so this one won't give you that springy feeling. It's a different lesson. It'll actually give you a really kind of soft, relaxed feeling. And that actually slows your running down for a couple of days. You'll feel really nice, but your speed will be lower. So don't do it the day before a race. Then again, nobody's racing right now, so it doesn't matter. But it will give you a chance to explore all of these things, the internal, external rotation, adduction and abduction, flexion and extension, and how that coordinates with movement of your pelvis and all the way through your spine into your upper body. And so definitely give that a try. And I think that's all I needed to say to you today. You know, if you want to come live onto the live stream, I will be happy to answer your questions at the ends of my videos. Otherwise, post your question in the comments and I'll try and answer it tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please hit like if you like this video so YouTube knows to show it to more runners. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't so that you don't miss a video. And please check out all the great resources I have for you on balancedrunner.com. I will see you tomorrow.